My name is Gerard Quinn and I'm moderating the panel discussion this afternoon. Educational psychologists reckon you forget 88 to 90% of anything you learn straight away. What you do stand a chance of remembering is where the structure of the field is, where the big issues are, and how you face into the future. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this session. So we've had a very good north-south day. I think everybody will agree. But what I want to do is put a few brief questions to the panelists, and I'll ask one or two people on the panel to take a lead on these questions. That's not to preclude others chipping in as well. And these questions are taken from the audience, generally, and thematized. And of course, after we do a round of questions, Caoimhghin Caolain will speak for a few minutes to you, and then we'll open it up to the floor, because we need to hear from you. So we won't take too long in the panel discussion, and so on and so forth. So first up, I want to ask John Dolan and Kevin Doherty to reflect on the fact that Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland have been travelling the same road for the last 30 years, a road away from charity toward the social model of disability, toward a human rights model of disability. I want you to reflect on that road from your own perspective, John, in the Republic, and Kevin in Northern Ireland, and maybe share your views with the audience about how deep that learning is now. How deep do people get the human rights model? And I don't just mean people with disabilities, I mean ordinary citizens and your political branch, your political class. So maybe beginning with John.
There's two parts to that question. I think that I was just having a very brief chat with Kevin a little while ago. And really what it was we're only a few miles from each other, and it's as if we're in very different worlds. And I comment I made was, I know more about what's going on in relation to disability in Eastern Europe than I do what's going on in Newry.
Okay.
And so I think that's a legacy of the situation that we've had on the island for a long time. That explains it. It doesn't excuse us in terms of getting on with it. And the other issue, remind me again, the second piece.
Do you think it's the human rights perspective on disability is shared widely?
I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I don't think it is. And I think even when you said the general public, we're all eloquent about my rights. And my rights exist in the context of somebody else's as well, because it's a shared. And I think we have rights in the context of our responsibilities as citizens as well. But that's a general comment, if we weren't looking at a situation in relation to disability. But in terms of disability, I think people have been, and the whole model which was care and support and help, and what people use the word the charity model, has become at this point an absolute hindrance. And how do we have a way to genuinely care for our brothers and sisters, for other people in our community, which doesn't put them in doesn't ring fence them in some way? How can we care in a community sense where people are out and about with enablers around them? I think somebody said, I think it was Eddie Malloy a number of years ago, he says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think all the time, and I gave an example this morning about the transport thing, that just not thinking. I think there are real ingrained issues for all of us.
A seasoned watcher of our parliamentary process for decades, you're now part of the parliamentary process. How would you characterise that journey in terms of public policy in this country as the Dáil, the Seanad become much more sensitised?
Will gratuitously, everybody in that whole system will talk about, and I think in their heads, in their heads, in their minds, yes, we must include people with disabilities. I think it doesn't follow on to what has to change about the way I think.
Okay.
One thing that was needed right at the very outset was looking at the seismic shift of how people think. And to do that, certainly within Northern Ireland, there was a strong leadership needed. And my predecessor, who was here earlier, who I know is not here today, took that leadership role, as in Monica Wilson. And I think what she identified then was, what's the fundamental change that's needed that will affect people with disabilities' lives on a day-to-day basis? And it was identified that the addressing the area of human rights was that need. And then there had to be a long-term vision of what needed to come in. Now, I think it's been mentioned quite a few times today by a number of speakers. That journey cannot be done alone. And Monica and Disability Action, I knew that. And it had to be done within partnership, looking at the disabled people organisations, disabled people themselves, government organisations, and even to highlight what John said, even the private sector, who provide transport, who provide built structures like one we're sitting in today. And I think for the human rights, it certainly has a way to go. We have to look at the whole area and continue. But that vision can't be lost, and we need to continue to drive that. I think what we as an organisation have identified today within Northern Ireland is that it cannot be done alone. It has to be done in partnership with with everybody in general, if we're going to make seismic change for everybody.
Yeah, and I suppose this has echoes of what somebody mentioned in the audience earlier about intersectionality, about building alliances, a slow burner, and gaining confidence and moving ahead on that basis.
And just to finish, I think what is really needed as well, and we all have a part to play in this, is that strong leadership and vision that what we want to achieve.
Yeah. Mind you, Monica Wilson for decades has been extremely strong on the north-south dimension of disability policy, to her immense credit. Anybody from the group? Sarah?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention briefly the idea of protection, because it's something that's come up very recently in the conversation around the reform around sexual offences. So our laws around sexual offences were one of the things that had to be changed, that we identified to change before we could ratify. And the language that was used by our Minister for Justice was around our need to put in laws that protected the person. It wasn't about laws that protected the rights of the person to have, meaningful relationships, sexual relationships of their choice. And so we're still slipping back into that mindset constantly around what we need to do, what structures we need to put in place to protect the individual from abuse, without having, and there's nothing in the convention that says that people need to be protected, particularly because they're disabled, but there is a lot in the convention that says their rights should be protected the same as everyone else's. That was very much glossed over in relation to that particular piece of law reform. That's very recent, and I think that that's something that prevails.
So we can have good law, we can have good policy, but if the mindset still exerts an undertow bringing us backwards, that's the one to watch for, which is why culture is so important north and south of the border. Anybody else from the panel want to chip? Oh, okay. Bronagh.
I understand how people are saying that we have made quite a bit of progress over the years, but I think we need to be very mindful at the moment about what's going on around disability rights. I think we're experiencing rights tensions at the moment, where disabled people have never had as many rights on paper as they have at the moment, but we're also in a position where there are significant budget cuts, welfare reforms that are having a negative impact on disabled people. So it's almost that there's a fear and a sense of being uncomfortable about human rights, and that disabled people are potentially seen as too expensive. I think I'm quite concerned that we are potentially going down that route, and we need to be very mindful of that.
Let's come back to that momentarily, because it can give a rise to a lot of cynicism if we have a glittering treaty that we ratify, if we've nice laws on the book, and yet the sufficient allocation is not made to bring it to life for people. It can really generate a lot of cynicism in the community. But let's package that in the corner for the moment, and we will come back to it. Gary.
Yeah, I think there as well, there's a perception out there that as soon as Ireland ratifies the CRPD, that the world is going to change for everybody in Ireland. And I think we have to get a bit of realism as well on that. I think the other point which was very disappointing, talking about the sexual offences bill, was that the minister actually said, quoted the CRPD, and she said it was because of the CRPD that people had to be protected, which again is a very, it shows it shows the mindset that's there. I don't mean to single out the minister of that, but it just does show what we're up against. The other element then is people viewing, and particularly lawyers, but viewing disability as a human rights issue. It is a human rights issue, yet people just can't see that. They can't understand. They can't see that disability is actually a human rights issue as well.
So this gets to a very interesting debate about what's the most important thing about the convention. Is that it creates a new process that we're part of, what people call the new politics of disability, or is it that it guarantees you a certain result? And there are a lot of people who would say it's actually the process that's most important, because you can fix one or two bad laws, but unless you're addressing the process that generates those bad laws, you actually haven't done much. Maybe we'll come back to that later. Let me move on to the second round, which is really Northern Ireland focused. The UN committee you've ratified, congratulations, Northern Ireland, UK. And the UN committee has generated a list of important issues for you to reflect on, having to do with, I think, Northern Irish non-discrimination law needs to be tweaked further to bring it into line with UK law. You have this reservation on inclusive education in Article 24 that you have to work away from. You have a lot more to do in terms of guardianship reform, at least from the point of view of the UNCRPD committee. Do you think they were the big issues? Do you think they got it right? Is there anything else you'd like to add to that? And what added value do you see this process in the UN committee having for you on the ground in Northern Ireland in bringing about reform? So, Bronagh and Kevin.
I think we need to be aware of the limited resources of the committee for a start. It's impossible to cover absolutely everything in the list of issues, so that's the first point that we need to be concerned with. I think the list of issues are really important in terms of enabling us to reflect on where we are, where we need to get to, and enabling us to be really focused in what we do. They're a really important lobbying tool, really important way of helping us hold government to account. So I think there's a lot of value in that, but I think we need to also be quite strategic in identifying the issues within that document, and we need to follow it up with a proper plan of action going forward.
Yes. And have you intentionally thought through how you're going to use the eventual report from the UNCRP committee in the Northern Irish parliamentary system? Is that something you're strategizing at the moment?
Yes, we did. We've been working with the Department for Communities on the new programme for government, and it's great to see some representation here from the department. But one of the key things that we think for the future rollout of the programme for government is making sure on the future that we try and instill human rights into the programme for government. And to that, whilst it's not there at the moment, but I think one of the key things that we want to do, and I'm saying the disability sector. And I'm saying everybody again, because I'll go back to the committee, is making sure that we can work with the department and the department work with us to make sure that the rollout of that programme for government, and again I agree with Bronagh, the funding cuts that are happening in the north are very, very concerning and worrying for people with disabilities and their families. It's a huge concern. But I think on the future rollout, and hopefully if the Northern Ireland Executive can come together and have some common sense and get together and form a government, we can work with them to do that. Going back to the work within the committee that we are in, again, I emphasise the word partnership. It's not just an individual, it's partnership, and making sure everybody, and Tony quite eloquently highlighted this, it's everybody, it's not.
And do you think your civil society NGOs are being transformed by the process? For example, are they building bridges to each other that they wouldn't have done in the past? Are they imagining themselves not just as bodies that criticise government, but actually help government formulate blueprints for change? In other words, become policy entrepreneurs as well as critiques of government.
I think we have to get to that with that policy entrepreneur we have to get to. I think the NGO sector within Northern Ireland are still working on that. I think at the present moment, what I'm finding within the disability sector, within NGOs and the disability people's organisations, is a protective. We're being protective of what we have because we're so worried that of the funding crisis that there currently is.
Come to funding again later on, which is critically important. I was asked to ask you from the floor, because you're in this a bit longer than we are, what's one or two big takeaway lessons for us in the Republic of Ireland in terms of how we face into the process of monitoring, implementing the convention?
I think what you've already identified it, Gerard, whenever you said you can actually fix the laws, you can ratify the convention. Hopefully Ireland will ratify it very, very soon, but it's the path that you take then. It's actually, it's that process you take then, and it's the long-term vision. Yeah. And I think if, I think it was highlighted here just a few minutes ago, it's not just ratifying the convention, it's through the long-term vision.
And it's new ways of listening to citizens on the ground as well. Okay, Bronagh, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think for me, and Kevin already mentioned it, working in partnership is absolutely critical. Being inclusive of the whole range of disabilities and groups within our society. Recognising the time it actually takes and not underestimating that or leaving it to the last minute. I think that's really important. And capacity building as well.
You have to have a lot of energy and patience and Let me switch then south of the border to the Republic. You've seen that, well, we haven't ratified the convention. We're the last EU member state to do so, which is slightly embarrassing. We have gotten the assisted decision-making legislation out of the way. Okay, there are some compromises in it, but hopefully in the future we can work on those. And we now have the miscellaneous provisions bill before our parliamentary process, which purports to make 2 declarations under the treaty. And it also purports to change a number of other things to pave the way for ratification. What's your view of that bill, John, Gary, Sarah? Do you have any off-the-cuff remarks you would make? This is one thing I'd definitely like to change or add or subtract. What would it be? Sarah?
I'd like to see a complete bill. We don't have a complete bill. We've left significant parts of the bill out. Well, not we, but the Minister has left significant parts of the bill out. So one of the big areas that Inclusion Ireland are concerned about is the issue of deprivation of liberty and safeguards around that. We don't know what we're going to do about that. A bill has been published with a head which talks about deprivation of liberty but no detail. Worryingly, there's been no consultation on any part of that. I know that the Minister for Disabilities is offended by people saying that he hasn't consulted, but he hasn't consulted. Nobody's consulted on that specific, on any part of the disability miscellaneous bill, but specifically the deprivation of liberty safeguards would concern us. There are people with disability in institutions. There are people with disability who aren't in institutions. There are older people with disability who are de facto deprived of their liberty. There's no safeguards around that. The assisted decision-making legislation you referred to there, we enacted it in December 2015. We've only commenced 2 discrete parts of it. So without either of those things being put in place, assisted decision-making or deprivation of liberty safeguards, we'd be very concerned about what exactly is happening in particularly within institutions.
So just to be clear, when we talk about deprivation of liberty, we're talking about informal arrangements that effectively amount to deprivation of liberty, like being put in a nursing home without your permission, etc., etc. Can I ask you, why do you need that fixed now before we ratify, or why can't you leave it till later after we've ratified?
Well, we need it fixed yesterday, let alone after we ratify, and because it's just simply not good enough. We would know through our work in Inclusion Ireland that there are people who have been in institutions 40, 50, 60 years who may not know what the outside world looks like, let alone they've an entitlement to leave. People who are living in institutions where there's alarms on doors, they're constantly surveilled, they're not being detained in accordance with any laws, they're simply just kept there, left there, and are not supported in any way to leave, let alone even know that they can leave. And I suppose what we would be aware of is that, being in institutions is of itself a human rights abuse, and certainly gives rise to huge amounts of opportunity for human rights abuses.
And it's an issue that confronts Ireland legally, not just because of the Disability Treaty, but because of the European Convention of Human Rights, where the case law is absolutely clear that we need to put in a legislative basis. So Gary, hand it over to you.
Yeah, and just following on from that, I mean, specifically in the area of mental health law, the only persons that are entitled automatically to have their detentions reviewed are persons that are held involuntarily under the Mental Health Act. Whereas the vast majority of people that are admitted on a so-called voluntary basis. So it is very urgent, and it should have been attended to a long time ago. The other difficulty is at the moment we don't have a national disability strategy. Our strategy has lapsed for the last year, 18 months. There is a strategy that has been drafted. It went out to consultation for 15 months. Understand it came back in January, yet it hasn't been presented to government yet. So I'm just concerned that you know where is government priorities, and it clearly doesn't seem to be with people with disabilities.
So the mental health one is very interesting, because if you take some of the departure points of the convention seriously, it has radical implications for the shape of mental health policy and law into the future. And I think it's fair to say that pretty much all governments are at the very beginning of a transition phase in trying to work that out. But putting it to one side is not really an option.
No.
It should be least on the table. John, do you want to?
I was thinking of something earlier. I came up with this notion of the belly of the government or public services. You know,
The soft belly.
I mean, your gut instinct, your feeling.
Yeah.
I don't think government and public administration, and an awful lot of us, fully get what it means in our stomachs, right? And I think, therefore, yeah, we're going to do this piece, we're going to do that piece, yeah, we'll try and get more money, we'll try and do this, that. And if you take the bill before Christmas, that seemed to me, could be totally wrong, but it seemed to me, this is my feeling about it, is we got to get something out to them before Christmas, before the end of the year, because we said we'd have the bill out and we'd have ratification done. And we got something that said bill on the front, had something on the back page, and had a miscellany of things in the middle. And that miscellany didn't include half the things they said should be dealt with in it. I'm worried about that. Not that I'm worried about that there isn't a thoughtful mind and instinct behind the thing that's going on. And I think there's three elements here. And let me just deal with one first of all. Our government and successive governments said we're going to ratify, and we ratify first, and it's our policy, and after that we'll get on with it. There's nothing in the convention that tells you can't do one single good new thing for people with disabilities before you ratify. All right? You can get on with the good work. We've a budget coming up. This is the business of resourcing. If our government has the instinct and the good grace to be really committed, and they say, look, we have, and there are thorny issues that there isn't, we don't have a template for, that how do you protect without spancling people? How do you protect and at the same time maximize people's autonomy and freedom? We don't have a lot of stuff to help us on that. We're trying to figure it out. But you could have a decent budget package in October that actually across the budget, across a number of departments, you actually see, do you know what, these people, this government is interested in disability, whether you live in rural or urban, to do with transport, to do with income, to do with health services, education. And that would restore our good faith, because I think that has been lost at this stage, whether by accident or design.
Am I reading into your words that you would be satisfied that if there was a clear strategy, A will do this, B will move on to mental health law, C will move on to liberty, and you could trust the system, that you'd be willing to just ratify now, or would you wait for everything to be perfect?
I can't see why they can't just take a deep breath and ratify.
Okay.
right? Because I think there has to be a leap of faith, and maybe all governments are kind of like, oh, well, conservative, if you like, when it comes to doing something in a very new way.
Yeah.
So, but even if they don't ratify before now in October, they can get the movement, if you like, back on side and say, well, look, we're not just talking. We've actually put a few bob here. We've made choices that will support people with disabilities and their families right across this country.
So Kevin and John, in terms of money, if the convention can never be a hard driver of resource allocation, what's left to it? Because that's where the rubber hits the road, right? Do you still nevertheless see it as generating added value in the policy process?
I think what's important to highlight, whilst we are here to talk about the NCRPD today, and we're here to look at all, the ratification process and how the monitoring process takes place and all that, there has to be a fundamental want from government to make a difference to disabled people. There has to be a fundamental, and the disability sector and the DPOs and disabled people can influence that, but we have to make sure, and I think John's touched on this, that government want to make a change. And whilst resources are limited, and they're limited everywhere, there's other countries out there in the world that are really making change. And I think Rhoda highlighted Malta, some good practice today. And I think there has to be, whilst everybody can hide behind a budget and behind the lack of funding, and even hide behind the fact we've ratified the NCRPD, so we're doing a good job. No, there has to be a fundamental want from government to improve the lives of disabled people.
Yeah, so it's not just doing it because a treaty tells you to do it, it's doing
there
it
has to be a absolute fundamental want.
Yeah, John?
I'm going to make it, I hope it's not too subtle, distinction between resourcing and funding. There is new money needed. That's if we plain up funding. But we have resources already, billions of resources in our public services. It's about recalibrating as well the way they're planned and operated. And just an example that I used this morning, that transport strike, when an agency of government, the National Transport Authority, said it's okay not to have a fleet of accessible, these ones belonging to Bus Éireann on the route, because the private operator has enough seats for the number of people who want to travel on that route. But not one of those buses was accessible. Well, there's two elements there. The first element of that is that none of the technical people said, hold on a minute. These buses cannot serve some of the public that have as much of a right to travel as anyone else. So resourcing is about headset and how people think and understand their public duty and their public work.
I mean, we do know about the inquiry into austerity in the UK, and that's a really interesting case study for us to look at in the Republic and think about it. But let me move on, because I know I need to open it up to people. In terms of mutual learning, North and South, do you have any ideas about how we can move this forward? Because I sense there's consensus in the room. This was a really good exercise today. Perhaps there are ways of building on that into the future. Anybody? Not addressed at anyone in particular.
I think I'd be very interested to hear more about the involvement of disabled people in the monitoring process. I think that the Maltese experience, we have a lot to learn. We're proposing something similar in Ireland. It was a bit worrying to see the committee that Ruth Gallagher from Oireach referred to earlier, that's being set up to advise Oireach in the disability miscellaneous bill was only proposed for them to be half people with lived experience with disability, and I suppose my preference would be that it would be entirely people with lived experience with disability, and that would be, meaningful participation as well, rather than just we spoke about not even having consultation earlier, but unless that's meaningful participation, and that advisory group really are an advisory group, I'd be worried about that being a tokenistic exercise. So I think the experience of Malta will hopefully, and I know you asked about North-South, sorry, so I shouldn't have brought Malta into it, North and South of the continent, but I hopefully will be able to hear more about that anyway.
Sure. Let's throw it open to the floor now. We have like 15 or 20 minutes, and I'm sure there's lots of hands. Okay. The gentleman in the jacket here first. We have roving mics, yes? Okay, thank you. Gentleman over here. Yes, perfect.
Jerry Kerr, Fighting Blindness and National Council of Blind. Could I put a point to the panel? I'd love to get their imagination and creativity in on this point.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that's been annoying me for some time. I'll give you two very quick examples of it. How equality seems to be used as an excuse to stop equality. I think, as Diane said, to maybe increase sameness rather than equality. And if they can, as you said, Gerard, be in some way a policy entrepreneur around this point. Two quick examples. Mobility allowance. It was found under equality legislation that it should be extended to others. So, because there wasn't resources, it was taken away from everybody, leaving 4,000 people who were very disabled in a bad way. Second example, medical card and GP visit card promised in the last government for people with disabilities. But the expert group found not possible administratively to do it because there would be a hierarchy of medical needs which they could not assess. So all the people who are really badly off, really in need of a medical card, instead was done on a different administrative basis. So I just wonder if you could look at that in terms of the UN CRPD, if there can be some resolution to that. I wonder if Rosa Parks now came to the top of the bus, would she be sent back down, not because she was black, but because administratively there was some other different priority that wasn't the real need or the real priority for people with disabilities.
Thanks, Jerry. Gotcha. We'll gather up two more and then we'll do a round and then we'll likewise do two or three.
I think it's fundamental to this country that we start thinking about what we mean by the social model. We still use special needs. We still use awareness, disability awareness, instead of disability equality. Some people don't even know the difference between different disability awareness and disability equality. So we're still using special needs. We still have a charity sector that is predominantly non-disabled people working and functioning in those organisations. Another thing that I feel very strongly about is the HSE and the health sector. We have no power in the HSE. As patients, which we are seen as almost universally, we have no power. We can't complain about the services received. We can't get services. We have to beg, and grovel. Until you get disabled people out of the health sector, we won't have power and control of our own lives. I am sick to death of the health service executives' lack of respect, lack of dignity, and total gross abuse of power over us just because we have a disability or an illness. And I think the time has come to ask the question, what are the HSE doing about equality and human rights? Because it doesn't seem to exist in the HSE. Thank you.
We'll refer back to what John Dolan said. Two things. First of all, the word he used, we could have, at the beginning of a phrase he was going to use, and I immediately wrote down what we could have. We could have a decent attitude. We could have communication. We could have inclusiveness and openness and decency and nothing about us without us. Now, disability is evidently a health issue, but the Department of Health says they have nothing to do with health. The department can't get involved in the HSE because they've nothing to do with health. The World Health Organization says the Department of Health is in charge of health, and yet they say, well, that we've given the remit over to the HSE. Now, I don't believe people with disabilities should be held over a barrel of where they belong. On Liberty Hall during the celebrations of the 1916 Rising, I took a photograph of what it said on that. It said, we cherish all citizens equally in the Constitution. I am a citizen of this state. Every time I got to Tara Street, I saw the Liberty Hall saying we cherish you as a citizen of the state. I never felt cherished since I got sick or disabled with an acquired disability. I see an incredible amount of power over my quality of life, over my existence, over everything I do. I have never seen anything like such inspection of my personal life as I have seen since I became a disabled person. The files alone, health service executive, would make you crawl. Some of the things on those files are illegal and breaches of constitutional rights for me as a person, of a citizen of this state, and no one seems to realise what they're putting on these files. I will end here by saying I am a citizen. I happen to have a disability. I should, irregardless of the Convention of the Rights of People with Disability, be treated equally as a citizen of Ireland, because that's what I was born as.
So it's interesting that they're all dealing with issues of equality and citizenship. Jerry making the point that the theory of equality we use in the country can be used against us. We can equalise downwards as much as we can equalise upwards. Second speaker talking about the social model. Do we really get it? And the concept of equality inherent in the social model, when in practice all of our issues are still dealt with by the HSE, which is a bit of an anomaly. Why should the health department be dealing with this? And likewise, in the third question, we don't feel as if we're citizens of the country. We don't feel as if we're valued. Let me throw it open to the panel and see how you react.
Yeah, just following on there, what Anne was saying. I think it was Anne, wasn't Mark? Anne, just in terms of the proclamation. The proclamation actually it says equal rights, but it also says equal opportunities. So it says equal rights and equal opportunities for all citizens. The main state body in Ireland charged with the resources is the HSE. So it's that body really that's in control of the monies that's there to promote equalisation. And again, we've lobbied on this in the past in terms of getting social care out of the HSE, out of the Department of Health, and into either the Department of Justice or the Department of Social Welfare, because as long as you have it in health, they're always going to follow a medical model. And I think in terms of legislation, we have to be careful around that. I'm just thinking of the Disability Act, for example. There, suddenly you have the resources following assessments of under sixes, whereas to the detriment of the rest of the rights and resources that should be available for other matters as well. So I think we have to be careful, but I think you're dead right. I think it should be out of health and into another department.
Thanks, Gary. Anybody else in the panel? John, Bronagh?
Just to go back to the first question around equality, I have a real problem with the way in which the language of equality is used among disabled people when we compare to how it is used among women, for example, children and young people and other groups. I think there's no other group in society where we talk about reasonable adjustments, where we talk about justifiable discrimination, and where equality is based on how much it's actually going to cost. So I think equality can at times be used against us, and it's important that we challenge that and say, it's not right for us to be viewed in terms of cost, in terms of budget, and in terms of money. We're human beings, and equality is much more than that. Equality is about our dignity, our inherent value, and it should not just simply be reduced to cost.
Thanks, Bronagh. John?
Just to briefly start off with Jerry's observations about the equality being used against us, and as he was about to say it, I was thinking the mobility allowance. It's fascinating, and Bronagh has made the point there that equality was shoved down our throats in relation to the difficulties with that allowance. I'll make 2 points. If they brought in legislation at that time, and this issue was hanging around for 5, 6, 7 years, it just wasn't being dealt with. That could have been dealt with very, very easily if there was an interest and a will to do it. The other thing that strikes me about that is why, and it speaks to the other points that have been made about health, why is the health vote paying for a mobility scheme? Would that not be the Department of maybe Transport? So there's amazing oddities in the way the thing, and it comes back to that. I think it really comes back to that cultural thing. One final point, and I'm not doing justice to all the comments that were made. 2004, Epson Act isn't fully implemented. 2005, the Disability Act, just been referred to. 2007, the Citizens Information Act in relation to the Advocacy Director. There's 3 pieces of legislation over a decade old. And really what I'm saying is we're now, and rightly in one way, very excited about or maybe not excited, but we want to get this miscellaneous bill through to get ratification. Getting it through doesn't mean it's implemented. And that's why I keep coming back. We need the government to put some skin in the game to actually do something real. And their opportunity to do that, as Deputy Caoimhghin said, is in the budget, and we all get back on side and we work out the thorny issues that need to be worked out and move it on. And the point you were making about that, not just having a go, being a sector that has a go at government, but also our capacity to be able to problem solve or be part of the problem solving.
Caoimhghin?
John. No, just in relation to equality comes across in each of the contributions. I hold strongly to the view that it is an absolute pillar of what we should be as a society. I think it's crucial. It should be a cornerstone of all that we do. So where it has been used negatively, that's hugely regrettable. But we've got to look at alternatives where greater vision was used, albeit sectional. The medical cards were referred to. The gentleman who spoke first referred to medical cards. We now have a situation where medical cards are an automatic entitlement of children in receipt of domiciliary care allowance. It's a first step. I only see it, and all of these are steps towards the ultimate realization of a universal healthcare system across this country where we're all entitled to access as of right. I believe we are. We have that entitlement, but unfortunately the structure of the system of delivery is at fault. In relation to the HSE, I was spokesperson on health for 14 years before taking up my current portfolio responsibilities. Now, I certainly don't want to start on the HSE at this point in time. It breaks my heart. It has done so on many, many occasions. I feel that the HSE, as it is currently structured, whatever about restructuring, we've had the old system up to 1977 where the local authorities were responsible for the provision of health services within their governance. The advent of the health boards that led up then to the HSE, I think 2005. I mean, we can continue to look at restructuring, but what we need is a new and a visionary leadership, and that quite clearly is not currently the case. And we're not providing the resources either in order for some of those with responsibility within the HSE structures to demonstrate their own capacity to be visionary. And I think we have got to recognise that that's also a contributory factor. And finally, in relation to the lady who spoke last, and I've met them both before and delighted to hear your contributions here today, citizenship should have ensured that all that we're discussing here today was delivered as of right. Citizenship should be the key qualifying condition for the entitlement of all born here or who have taken up citizenship here, that is a fundamental right. Access to quality healthcare and the necessary supports to allow each of us, as has been earlier said, not only to enjoy our national and independent rights, but also the opportunity to fulfill ourselves within our lifetimes.
Well said. Thank you very much. Just on a point of information, the chairperson of the UN CRPD committee, Theresia Degener from Germany, writes a lot about the theory of equality in the treaty and calls it a transformational theory of equality. Very, very interesting work. And also on a point of information, our very first programme for government in 1919 contained a pledge to get rid of the poor law, and it very much looks like to me that the medical model in the HSE is the continuation of the poor law into the 21st century. So gentleman in the middle, another gentleman here in the purple shirt, and a lady in white down the back.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. This is aimed, and ladies, this is aimed at Caoimhghin and John specifically, because they basically have the power to do something about this. Do you both feel that it is discriminatory that disability allowance and disability benefit is tied to the unemployment assistance and unemployment benefit rates, seeing that unemployment assistance and unemployment benefit are temporary payments while you're unemployed, whereas the people with disabilities are actually, in this room, are permanent?
Okay.
I was brought up in Belgium mostly. We find that as the National Council of People with Disabilities in the Republic of Ireland, where we are established to be the continuation of the members and the networks of PWDI. When it was announced that PWDI would lose its funding, we got our senators to ask if we could continue as independent networks and organisations without government funding, and we are still there. And we're sitting in committees and we're raising things in Europe, meeting with other committee members on online forums and flying in. I'm flying to Belgium this weekend tomorrow, and I'll be having meetings with colleagues from Belgium and Netherlands as usual. We find the fact that an awful lot of service provider organisations tend to be parent-led organisations. We find from our colleagues in other countries that still the disability organisations that are out there still have a majority of parents, relatives, carers claiming to represent, because the people with disabilities are unable to speak or represent themselves in domestic law. How can we establish ourselves to make sure that we have a majority of us in charge, that we are running nothing about us, without us, by us, and a majority of us, not of service providers or parents?
Absolutely. Okay,
membership is free on both sides of the border. We have members in Northern Ireland. We have members in the Republic. We will be going into areas where there haven't been networks of people with disabilities in every city and county in the country for years, and we will be re-establishing. We're looking for people from disability organisations. By our definition, a disability organisation is a service user, a peer or advocacy organisation, a social group, or a committee of a house or service for people with disabilities, of which the people with disabilities are the majority.
Okay.
So they cannot be run by or represented by or emailed done by the service providers or parents' organisations.
And of course, support for civil society groups of people with disabilities lapsed by the government 5 or 6 years ago.
I sit on committees in the Clare Public Participation Network, representing social justice for NCPD on the Environment and Transportation Committee. I sit on European and international committees. I travel a lot.
I got you. We've only about 8 minutes left.
And people bring me issues, and I bring them to Geneva, and I raise them in Malta, etc.
But I suppose I just want to say thank you very much for organising today. But there is actually one thing missing, Gerard, and I don't think yourself or Gary or Sarah probably does recognise it, but there's actually one voice missing here today in relation to the voice of lived experience of those, you know, that have experienced forced detention, drugging, electroshock, seclusion, restraint. And that's one of the main reasons why the CRPD isn't being ratified, because they want to hold on to that. They want to hold on to that right, and the psychiatry lobby is really strong.
Interesting.
And you have somebody like Professor Brendan Kelly, who's highly qualified ethics, law, psychiatry, but he uses the CRPD to say you cannot deprive people of this right. We need to hold on to the right to even to forcibly electroshock people. That is not okay, and nobody challenges him.
Okay.
I'd just like to say all the legislation that has come forward, the capacity legislation, functional capacity test, a presumption of a capacity, which means absolutely nothing to people on the ground when they're present in one of these units once you cross the threshold. They took unwilling out of the Mental Health Act. Again, it means nothing when you can move people to the unable category for forced electroshock, forced treatment. The Disability Miscellaneous Provisions Bill, there is no consultation. Finian McGrath looked up at me in the public gallery. I'm still waiting. I have never met him. I have never actually met a minister, despite advocating for 3 to 4 years. And I'd like, I suppose, all the members to reflect. John, we haven't got a voice. We haven't been invited into the Seanad to present, you know, the way the other disability groups were. You know, our voice isn't there. And I get people in the Seanad are doing fabulous work, and your group are doing fabulous work, but our voice is not heard. And we're really the Cinderella of human rights in every respect. And Gerard, just you didn't mention the ERC Voices project, which is based in the Centre for Disability Law and Policy. It's an international project around legal capacity. And, you know, some of those voices really need to be heard. And I'd hope you would all follow that project. And something similar needs to be done in relation to the Irish voices, you know, an equivalent of forced treatment, forced drugging, forced electroshock.
Thanks very much for that. There was one lady here very persistent with her hand up, so please in the last round.
My question is just around just social change and how people with disabilities view other people with disabilities. I think it was Sarah that said about institutionalisation and how some people don't even realise that they're allowed to leave or that they're allowed to make their own decisions. And I think I just have a question. How do you even go about changing that, changing the mindset of people with disabilities, their parents, carers, and society in general? Because it doesn't seem like it's going to be very easy to do that. Even if we look at marriage equality, like people still don't agree with it. There's still a stigma there. So I was just wondering if anyone would have any ideas in relation to that.
So unfortunately we're coming to the end of the panel, and I'm just going to put these questions to the panelists. Lots of people have questions, but I'm sure you can interact with the panel members afterwards and continue the conversation later. Very specific question about entitlements and the conditioning of entitlements. Very specific, well, more general, but what I'm gathering from it is support for civil society and how it could be put in place. Government needs civil society. It needs that voice at the table, but returns that means some support has to be provided to civil society. Very sharp, very interesting questions on forced treatment, which is like part of the whole mental health law debate and the future of mental health law, question mark. And then very interesting question about culture and how we nevertheless can change laws, policies, practices. But if the people who continue to function in a sector operate under a very old paradigm, how can we shift things up? How can we really change? So let's do one last round, maybe even just do it across. Yeah, Caoimhghin, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I have the machine in my hand. I'll take the opportunity, but just because the gentleman asked the question directly, and be very brief on the rest. You make an absolutely cogent point. I think it is very, very important to recognise that you cannot determine the needs and the cost of life the cost of living in terms of a person and persons with a disability based on any comparator with unemployment assistance, unemployment benefit that have very different qualification criteria and that are geared towards specific timeframes. Hopefully in life they're short term. Your point is absolutely valid, and I welcome it because it's something that I will most certainly reflect in the opportunities that are open to me, and I thank you for it. In relation to some of the other points, and just very, very quickly, I grew up in a family where parents and friends was very much a part of the vernacular because I had a special brother, the real cement that keeps us all together. I've seen where it is primarily, and it remains the case, and in fairness to Finian McGrath, he's also a parent. But I found in my 20 years as a member of our Oireachtas here that in trying to interest, to even excite people in terms of action, it is primarily those who were coming from a direct life's experience in dealing either with a disability, either themselves within their home environment or closely to them, that you get the best response. We have to broaden that responsibility. It is a societal responsibility, and I do believe that some progress is being made. It's slow, unfortunately, but there is some progress, and there are some markers that give us hope. If I could only say to the lady who spoke in relation to the, I suppose, the mental health issues, the lady's name? Fiona. I beg your pardon, Fiona, if you can hear me. All I'd like to say is I've no doubt, and I mean I've witnessed personally the work that John and the team around him are doing in Leinster House, and I want to take the opportunity here today to acknowledge it and to say that it's an honour and privilege to be there in compliment to it. But I would like to say that it wouldn't have been possible. I don't want him to have to defend himself. I'll offer it myself as an observation in the short time that John is there, that he could have met or accommodated all of the various interests right across the sector. It just would not be physically feasible. But I would like to say that I'd be very happy to host an engagement by you and colleagues with our spokesperson, because one of the things we were able to do, and for the very first time after the February 2016 election, where I had been spokesperson on health for 14 years, it covered everything. We were able with increased numbers to specialise, and we do have somebody dealing specifically in relation with mental health, mental ill health, and all of the related matters. I have taken on disability rights and older people, and we have two other colleagues. We have four now covering what was previously done by one. But if you were to contact me, I'll very, very happily organise that point of access for you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Caoimhghin. And you're coming up to your 20th anniversary in a few weeks' time, isn't that right? Yeah, younger you're getting. Anyway, look. First question was the one from Kieran. It is brilliant that our unemployment rate has come down from something around 16% to 6%, and it'll hopefully drop another bit. Can't drop too much more. Thankfully, the contingency of unemployment has been to a great extent dealt with. There will be a hardcore, which is an issue of people who never find it into the world of employment, and that's before we even talk about people with disabilities. And the last government moved heaven and earth with all sorts of schemes and plans and initiatives to get back to employment. And I'd love to see, and this makes the point, can the same imagination, will and determination be brought to the issue for people with disabilities in relation to employment? It is still a horrendous situation. And your point is there is no there is no decent acknowledgement of the extra and ordinary costs. I'm not even talking about specialist wheelchairs, this kind of thing, the extra and ordinary costs that people right across the disability spectrum, including mental health, have in their day-to-day lives. That is a major scandal, and very hard so far to get movement on that. The point that was made in relation to parents' representatives or whatever, a lot of my time in the past has been spent with organisations in the physical and sensory disability sector, and there it's either people themselves or other folk, not necessarily members of their families, that are involved in it. So that's a different, there's different things happening in different parts of the movement. The civil society voice, and you particularly, Gerard, mentioned that is very, very important. Fiona's points, I heard them very strongly. There is no difficulty if for anybody, and I'll say this not to Fiona alone, but to anybody, both myself and my colleagues, and there's a group of us in the Shannon, but I don't even want to keep it to that, because I know people across all the different parties have an interest in these areas, and I'm getting to know more of them. Happy to sit down and listen to people and hear what people are saying. And in regard to the civil engagement group, and there's some other particular independents in the Shannon, we have a particular interest in the civil. There is a civil society thing very much going on there, and so that's lovely to see, particularly in the Shannon, and be happy to facilitate people in any way, insofar as there's hours in the day. The NIAV trainee social worker, as I describe it, and I said this morning, I keep going on about what do I call it, cultural change, and then I said, and I was arrested by something that Robbie had said, faux pas are things that we hadn't got right today, right? Cultural change isn't just looking at other people. The virus is in all of us. There's a bit of it in all of us, at least some of the time. We go back into default, and we just don't realise. Oh, I didn't realise. So we do need to be arrested by our nearest and dearest and those around us, and I don't see it in any other way, that kind of critique. It is really, really, really important. My final point, it's back to an early one, the charity health thing, or charity social. One of the determinants of becoming a registered charity is that you are an organisation of public or community benefit. And I've often regretted that we didn't push at the time of the Charities Act to have the Act actually called the Public Benefit Act. You're not a private organisation if you're a charity. You're there, you're allowed to become a charity because you're about public benefit and civil benefit, civic benefit. I think that's an important, and that would help us maybe break down that social versus charity model. Yeah. Because it goes back to pre-democratic institutions and governments and whatever.
Gotcha. Thank you, John. Bronagh?
Yeah, just very quickly, two points. One is just in relation to employment. I think it says it all. The comprehensive employment strategy, which was launched 15 months ago, was launched by the Ministers for Social Welfare and Health and Justice. Health, Justice and Social Welfare are the three departments involved in it. No sign of Jobs and Enterprise at all, because it's a disability matter. Jobs and Enterprise don't understand why they should be involved in the comprehensive employment strategy. The question has been asked, how many people with disabilities have got a job since the employment strategy was launched 15 months ago? The answer is probably none or very little. Second point then, just in relation to the mental health question, the convention does say that no persons shall be detained solely on the grounds of disability. So I think the committee is going to be ruling on that at some stage, but and I am familiar with Brendan's writings on it as well, and I know he has various views in relation to that. But I'll pass it on to Sarah now.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief. I don't know if changing the law changes culture or not, but I do know that bad laws create bad culture, and I do know that it provides excuses for people to remove other people's rights, and I do know that when we do that, people live up to that, and when we chip away at the status of people, then we get people who have been disenfranchised, who don't have access, don't have power. When we have acts on statute like the Lunacy Act of 1871 today, people being made wards of court, being branded lunatics and idiots by their country, then yeah, people feel that. People feel that and people believe that. And so the big difference, I think, between disabled persons movement, if we want to call it that, and the women's movement and marriage equality and even things like, you know, the trade union movements, it has to be driven by the people themselves. And I suppose the ambition for disabled, you know, disability representative organisations like Inclusion Ireland and other organisations is that our ambition should be to fade away. Our ambition should be to pass the baton over to persons with disabilities to take the fight on themselves. We're distance from that, I think, particularly in the area of intellectual disability. We have a huge amount of, I hate the term, but capacity building to do. But the first thing we have to do is get our laws right, because if we do that, then people will hopefully then start to believe that they are entitled to equality of citizenship and that their status is, you know, equal. And by the way, we've been talking a lot about equality of opportunity today, and maybe it's the socialist in me, but I'd like us to aspire towards equality of outcome if we could. I know it's not a principle of the convention, but let's aim high.
Thank you.
Just very, very quickly, because I can see Martin hovering there, so I know you're clipping those up. So I just want to make one observation, really, from the last question from Niamh. Niamh, you're probably the youngest here, so it's very fitting that you had the last question, because the future is with people like you. And I think that with your generation, that they can engage with disabled people on a regular basis with the actual fundamental ethos of improving the lives of disabled people. That is the key message. We go to conference upon conference upon conference. What we have to do is take something away from today, and it is improve the lives of disabled people. And yet we have to work together, all of us, to do that.